Welcome to the Center for Learning Disabilities Community Workshop. Our topic tonight is components of a best practice bilingual evaluation. And we have two really great guest speakers with us tonight. We have Mary Bush Thomas from the Region 16 Service Center and Christy Trevino from Amarillo ISD. So I'll get started by telling you a little bit about Mary. So Mary is a learning leader at the Region 16 Service Center in Amarillo. She provides professional development and technical assistance for teachers, administrators, and other constituents working with emergent bilingual students. She's a former Spanish teacher and former school counselor, and she's provided professional presentations at the local and state level. Her work with Texas school districts focuses on compliance for federal regulations, instructional best practices, and consultation for programming that supports biliteracy, content-based language instruction, and culturally responsive teaching. So that's Mary. And then our other guest today is Christy Trevino. Christy is a bilingual educational diagnostician from Amarillo ISD. She has a bachelor's degree in secondary Spanish and a master's degree in the educational diagnostician program from West Texas A&M. And she also holds a bilingual educational diagnostician certificate from Sam Houston State University. And she specializes in providing best practice for emergent bilingual evaluations. So welcome, Christy and Mary. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hart. We're very happy to be here too. Thank you to the CLD team, and thank you to all of you out there who are practitioners or students or teachers or parents for allowing us to come in and share some information with you today. So we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to talk about in a short amount of time. So this is us, this is me, and this is Christy. And since you did such a beautiful job of introducing us, I'm going to skip right through that and get to the meat of this. So thank you. I thought I'd start out by talking a little bit about what the demographics are across the state of Texas and how Region 16 plays into that demographic. So this may surprise you, it may not surprise you, but we have about 120 languages that are spoken across the state in Texas public schools. 99% of all of our school districts have identified emergent bilingual students. So what that means is like almost everybody has an emergent bilingual student in their school district. One thing that I want to point out to you is that I think is really interesting is if you look at Region 16 where Amarillo is, you see it's in the light blue. And if you look down at Region 20, where San Antonio is, it's also in the light blue. So what that says is between 11 and 15% of our population in our schools are emergent bilingual students. And that surprises me a little bit because I would have guessed San Antonio would have been a much higher percentage rate than Amarillo, Texas. But because of the industry that we have here and because we've been a refugee resettlement center for a number of years, we do have a very high population of emergent bilingual students here in the Region 16 area. So drilling down a little bit to Region 16 demographics, we have 81,980 students, and that's distributed across our 61 school districts. And at Region 16, we serve all of those school districts. Within those school districts, we have more than 40 different languages or dialects that are spoken, and the most common ones are in that purple box. So you can see Spanish, of course, is the top language. If you remember the other slide that I was showing you, 88% of the students in the state of Texas speak Spanish. So that is by far the largest second language that we have. In Region 16, 98% of our school districts serve emergent bilingual students. And so in real terms, what that means is only one school district has not reported any emergent bilingual students in their school district. So compared to San Antonio, we have 12,051 emergent bilingual students. That's 14.7% of our student population. And I believe it's now higher than San Antonio's. So having said all of that, that's a significant population of students. And when we're looking at special considerations for students, when we're thinking about evaluating them for services of any kind, there's some things that we really need to be familiar with as an evaluation team. So I'm going to talk about the considerations that we need to have prior to the evaluation and during the evaluation, but Christy's going to get to the meat of probably what you're here to listen to and about the specifics of the evaluation process. So prior to an evaluation, there are a lot of things that the team needs to be familiar with. For one thing, they need to be familiar with how we acquire a second language, what second language acquisition is about, and then what kind of instructional programming has the student had prior to when they came to our school district, or have they had while they were with us? We also need to ask a lot of questions. And what I found at Region 16 is sometimes people call and ask me the questions, but they haven't asked the right questions at their school district level. So they need to know the difference between the different orthographic systems. They need to know what language. Sometimes they're not exactly sure if a student spoke a dialect or if they came from a different country other than Mexico. They're not exactly sure about some of the answers to some of these questions. So what orthographic systems did they have, and what's the impact of that orthography on the characteristics of either dyslexia or some other learning disability? There is formal and informal data that needs to be gathered that might be a little bit different for an emergent bilingual student than any other student that we might be evaluating. So what are some of those questions that we need to be asking, and where do we need to look for the answers? Of course, we need to have special considerations for that identification of the emergent bilingual student, but we also have to think about, well, if we do identify a student with a disability and they are a bilingual student, then how are we going to serve that student? And what kind of services do we have? And then who can provide those services for those students? So let's start out talking a little bit about second language acquisition. Some of these things you may be very familiar with, and some things you may not be familiar with. So I'm just going to shoot down the middle and talk about the basics. So there are two layers of language that we think about when we're thinking about second language acquisition. We look at the layer of language that's social language, what we call BICS, or basic interpersonal communicative skills, with our students. So when you get a student who comes in as a newcomer and they have a very low level of English language proficiency, their BICS are going to come quickly. They're going to learn emergency survival language. So they're going to learn within about 2 years how to converse with their peers, ask questions, get information from their teacher, how they're going to learn how to go through the lunch line or ask for directions, just your basic kinds of survival kinds of questions. On the other hand, the language that they really need to be successful in things like the STAR test and academic, independent academic work in the classroom, that takes a lot longer. And we call that language CALP, or cognitive academic language proficiency. It may take anywhere from 5 to 7 years to develop that. And to be honest with you, it's kind of an ongoing process through our lives. So those are two things to consider when we're thinking about a newcomer student. There are things that affect second language acquisition and how quickly a student is going to acquire a second language. What we start out thinking about is their affective filter. An affective filter is an imaginary screen, I would say, that inhibits a student's learning when certain outside factors are present. So for instance, if a student doesn't feel like they're in a safe environment, if a student feels threatened, if a student doesn't have their basic needs met, or it could be something inside that student. It could be internal. It could be that they're just a shy person, or it could be that they've had some kind of trauma that happened to them before they came to the United States. All of those things can affect how well they're able to lower that affective filter and engage in learning. Another thing that affects a second language acquisition is their native language development. Remember our BICS and CALP? Well, it doesn't just exist in the second language, but it also exists in their primary language. So I often ask a district when they call and start asking questions about assessment, I say, well, what is their language like in their native language? Are they I know they can speak and communicate in their primary language, but are they literate? Can they read and write? What's their academic language in their native language? Because that's important to know. The higher level language that they have in their native language, the easier it's going to be for them to transfer to the second language. And finally, and one of the most important things that's going to influence a student's acquisition of language is going to be the instructional practices of the teacher. Are they providing services in that student's native language? It's not necessary for a good teacher to be able to do that because a lot of our districts don't have the ability to do that. But does that teacher understand how to make cross-linguistic connections? Because we all learn something new by building on what we already know. So if a teacher knows a little bit about second language acquisition, how to make connections between the two languages, that can go a long way toward helping that student learn their second language quicker. When we were talking about instructional best practices, one of the things that may make a big difference with students is what program model that they have been instructed in or are presently being instructed in at the time we're considering assessing that student. So in Region 16, we do not have all of these program models. We have a few of them. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what this graph means in a second, but first let's talk about the kind of program models that we have in Region 16. Most of our school districts, most of them do not have bilingual programs. Most of them have English as a second language program, and many of those are pull-out programs. So what that means is that a student's English language instruction is provided by a certified ESL teacher in one way or another, either through their content classes or in their ELAR classes. So that's what most of our districts have. If they do have bilingual programs, and we have about 8 districts that have bilingual programs, most of those are early exit transitional. What that means is that their instruction is primarily done in their native language until they crack the code of literacy, usually around the 1st or 2nd grade. When that happens, they begin transitioning to a more heavy English program where eventually by the 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, it's an all English program and they leave that native language behind. We do have 3 districts in Region 16 that are dual language. We do not have any two-way dual language. We only have one way, and one way means it's all native Spanish speakers, but they are becoming biliterate. In other words, in a dual language program, we continue English and Spanish instruction. We never drop below 50% Spanish instruction throughout the life of the program. And none of our bilingual programs go past the 5th or the 6th grade in the Texas Panhandle. That's where they level off. So let's get to this graph, and what does the graph mean? This graph was designed by a team, Dr. Thomas and Collier, who did a longitudinal study years ago about the effectiveness of dual language. So you can see the achievement scores on the left-hand side. You can see the grade level down on the bottom. The dotted purple line at the 50 percentile is representative of native English speakers. So if you look at the graph, you can see which language programs are the most effective, and those would be the dual language programs because those students are getting reinforcement in both languages simultaneously through the 5th or 6th grade. So by the time you can see the trajectory just continues to go up for the most part. By the time they're in about the 6th grade or so, they are actually outperforming the native English speakers on a standardized achievement test. So that's not to say that ESL programs cannot be effective. They can be. It's just that the other ones are much more effective. So let's talk for a moment about the benefits of being a bilingual person. This quote says that phonological awareness skills developed in one language can transfer to another language, even while those skills are still in the process of being developed. We often get questions about this. You know, will my child be confused if they try to learn two languages simultaneously. And the thing that's great about being bilingual is that we can actually, our brains are so smart, they can actually inhibit that one language while we're learning the other language and vice versa. And actually, the skills that we learn in one help us learn the skills in the other language. So we definitely can learn two languages simultaneously. Another great thing about being bilingual is, and this has special interest to me because as we grow older, we start losing brain cells and connections in our brain. We start sloughing off that. And being bilingual is actually protective against Alzheimer's dementia. So like, yay, I love that. So just to demonstrate that, you can see in this picture, this is the image of a brain of a bilingual student while they're reading. So the top part of this picture demonstrates what a brain looks like, or the image of a brain of a bilingual student who's reading in their native language. So you can see where the areas of the brain light up there. But if you look on the bottom, it represents when a student is reading in their second language. So look at, there's so much more brain activity that's going on because that brain is having to work a whole lot harder, and it's pulling from all different areas of the brain to make sense of what's going on in that part that they're reading. So often in schools, when we get a student who's a newcomer and they don't speak English very fluently, or they have a low level of fluency in English, the first thing we do is like, let's get somebody who can translate for this child. And there's nothing wrong with that. Initially, that's great for the student, and it sometimes is a great thing for the teacher as well, because we kind of panic as teachers when we don't have somebody who can understand what we're saying. It will lower that student's affective filter initially. But if we continue doing that, we're going to have the brain that's the top brain. We won't have that same brain activity, and we're not going to have that student's not going to make that effort to learn that second language because they always know that translation is coming. So it's fine to support in native language. It's fine to have a translator in the beginning to lower that affective filter. But unless we're in a dual language program or a bilingual program, if we're in an ESL program, we want to be judicious about how much translating that we do for our students. So I want to talk to you just for a moment about different alphabetic systems or orthographies and how those may affect a student, especially a student that we might be thinking about assessing. So keep in mind that dyslexia exists across languages, but it may manifest itself a little bit differently. I had a friend one time that said, she said, you know, Mary, I am dyslexic in English, but I'm not dyslexic in Spanish. And I was like, does your brain know that? Because I think your brain is dyslexic, whether it's English or Spanish. So that was an interesting thing. But as I learned more about how that manifests itself within different orthographic systems, I learned, well, in a transparent orthography, where those phonemes and graphemes have a regular correspondence, it's not nearly so difficult to make sense of things as it is in an opaque orthography like English, where we don't have any consistent correspondence between the phonemes and the graphemes. It's much more difficult. And then one other thing to consider is in a lot of our school districts, we have children who come from a logographic orthography. In other words, those graphemes are representing meaning rather than individual sounds. I recently went to a conference, and this really drove it home for me. They asked us to copy a sentence in another language. And they said, copying is easy. You can do this. So I think it was in maybe French. So we all copied that pretty quickly. And then they asked us to copy another sentence. It said the same thing. It was in Russian. That was a little more difficult because the alphabet was different. And then they asked us to copy something in Arabic. Completely different system, right to left writing instead of left to right writing. It became quite a chore just to copy a sentence. So that really drove home to me how these different systems can affect our students when they come to us. So those are things to take into consideration when you're considering an evaluation for a student. Since English is an opaque orthography, it has a really heavy demand on phonological processing skills, and that's due to those multiple sounds that are represented by single graphemes. One fun fact that I always like to point out to people is that since English has a base of, well, so for instance, their BICS is based on Anglo-Saxon, and their academic or CALP is based primarily on Latin words. Think about it when you have a Spanish-speaking student who comes in, or a student who speaks a language that's Latin-based. They're going to make those connections to the CALP of the English language because that is what their language is based on. So as a teacher and instructor, if we can provide some of those cross-linguistic connections, such as just recognizing cognates. And by the way, there are about 20,000 of them in the English language that connect with other languages. Then that can help the student immensely with their comprehension skills. So for instance, in Spanish, just the regular word that a person would use if they wanted to say they're going to build something, they would use the verb construir. So that sounds like what English word that we know? Sounds like construct. So construct is already at a higher level than build. So I think that's a fun fact to point out to our students who speak Spanish. You know, hey, there are a whole lot of words that you already know, and you know they're a higher level of word. So that's really good for those students. So just as a summary of what we've been talking about, how dyslexia may manifest itself in an opaque language, a student is going to have early and marked difficulty with word level reading, whereas in a transparent language, they're going to have less difficulty until the words start getting more complex. So a word like regalo, that's just a common standard word, they're not going to have as much problem with. But when they start looking at words with diphthongs like siete, that'll be more of a problem, and they'll start having more difficulty with fluency and comprehension. In an opaque language, once they have improved that decoding and mastered it, their fluency and comprehension is going to improve. So just some risk factors, and Christy is going to talk to you about this more in depth when she gets to her part, but deficits in phonological awareness are going to be seen again across all languages. They're going to be more pronounced in less pronounced in transparent orthographies. But in rapid automatic naming, when you see those deficits, they will go across all orthographies. Just one last thing I want to talk to you about is when you're thinking about looking for clues about whether this is a language issue or whether this is language acquisition, some things you might want to look at that you wouldn't look at for other kids. Take a look at that student's home language survey. It's the first document that we give everybody when they register in a Texas public school. And if they answer anything besides English on it, they have to be assessed for English language proficiency. So look at that and see if it's consistent with whatever you're seeing with the student, because sometimes parents put funny things on those, so it may not be. Also, look at that student's oral language proficiency test. If they did put something besides English, then they should have been tested with an oral language proficiency test. By the way, that cannot be used in your formal evaluation if you're doing that. This is just for identification of English proficiency. Also, you want to look if they have been in the United States long enough. If they've been in Texas long enough, they'll have taken TELPAS. And so you might want to look at their TELPAS scores. We give it every year to determine whether a student has made progress in the English language. And we give it in all 4 language domains. So listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So you'll want to take a look at that if they have it. You'll want to pay attention to any kind of instructional interventions that student might have had in school. Think about their previous schooling, whether they were in or outside of the United States. Was it a school in a city? Was it a school out in the country? Did they have consistent schooling? So you're going to want to ask questions like that. And then finally, what program model did they come from? Did they come from an all native language setting? Were they in a bilingual program, maybe in another state or in another part of Texas? And now they're in my school, and we only have an ESL program, so it's all English, and they've been going from bilingual to all English. So those are all questions that you would want to ask yourself prior to the evaluation, and keep track of those kinds of things. They will give you clues. So I'm going to turn it over to Christy for a little bit. And Christy, if you want me to, I'll just keep clicking through as you ask me to, and you can talk us through a day in the life of a bilingual evaluator.
So just to walk through the assessment process, wow, I mean, it's everything to consider right before we even get started. Definitely, when a student is assigned, you have to get all that data gathering information. You have to consider everything. Before I even get started, I have just a data sheet that I have included, and it's just information that helps me to guide my assessment, because you know, and I always say this, at the end of the day, you know, we work for our students. We want to be able to provide the best, you know, and this is what this meeting is about, is just providing the best practices for our students. So considering all that data, you know, gathering and all that great information, before we even get started, before we even start any kind of cognitive, even achievement testing, one thing to look at is we look for which language are they dominant in, and that's on the next slide. What is their language dominance? Is their language dominant? There's several assessments that are out there, and the one that I particularly use is the Woodcock-Munoz language survey, which gives us like the basic oral language broad cluster. And so that, just with that information, along with everything else to consider, the TELPAS is last year, did they take their STAR in Spanish, and everything else to kind of consider. We want to know, what is their academic language dominance? Are they higher in English, or are they higher in Spanish? One other thing to consider before even starting any kind of assessment is we need to know, are they in a dual language program? Are they in the bilingual? Are they receiving ESL support? So with all that gathering and information, we're able to proceed. I always say, you know, and whenever I'm kind of explaining the bilingual evaluation process, you know, you kind of like to have just this model student. So even considering like for example, you have a student who and I have this one student that I have in particular. He came to the United States, came to Texas schools. He's a fourth grader, and he started in third grade here in Texas, but he was instructed in Mexico for kindergarten, first and second. And so, however, now today he has his language, his based on the Woodcock-Munoz language survey, he has higher English than he does in Spanish, but then he's being instructed in a dual language, receiving RLA instruction in Spanish. So that's where we're at right now. On the next slide is what I was just kind of going over. Which language is the student mostly dominant from, or dominant in? And that's the scores that we obtain from the Woodcock-Munoz, and that's just like the one that I use. On the next slide, other information to consider, and this is what Mary had sources to consider, is we do student interview before I even start testing. One thing I always say is, you know, like I'll ask the student, what language are you most comfortable speaking in? And they always say English, but then whenever we start speaking in English, they're not really comfortable in English. So then it's just, you know, then we start speaking in Spanish. And I always just tell them, like, well, let's just talk in Spanish. I know Spanish, let's just speak Spanish. So I kind of always just like to do that kind of like icebreaker with the student, and just kind of have like a little dialogue and just see like, how is what are they most comfortable in? Other information that the sources to consider is like the parent referral form. I don't know. I always want to say like it's a 50-50 toss up. Their home language, parent can report that the student's first language was English, and English is spoken in the home, but then you get the parent referral information that they completed 2 weeks before, and their student's first language was Spanish. So, and any questions that I have even before I start, even we still haven't even tested yet. Any questions that I have that I just kind of want to rule out is I contact the parent if there's anything that's in question or in doubt before I even start my assessment. I look at the teacher referral form. The teachers always they will give you their best. I mean, they're instructed in a dual language program, but yet their most dominant or conversational is in Spanish. Sources, more of information that I look at is their TELPAS scores. And then there's another assessment that's out there that I look at, but I'm not really too familiar with, is the loss. And then now we're ready to start testing. Gathering all of that great information, and sometimes it's overwhelming, and that's why I like to have everything just kind of like on a data gathering sheet, because you want to see everything right in front of you. Is the cognitive test selection. What are we going to start with? What are we going to do? There's many that are out there. I like using the KBC. The KBC is normed for LEP students. I have enjoyed working with using the WISC English and in Spanish, because it's new, and we have iPads. Well, I say that it's new. It's not new, but it's new to us because we have it on the iPads. And the test selection also is you have the cognitive, the Woodcock-Munoz, which is the bateria, and then you also have the English version. And one other thing, once you give in every G selection, as far as like the test, once you're testing in every area, one thing, there's a few things to consider whenever you're going to follow up in a different language, and just kind of, again, looking at all the data and all the information that you have from the student, is following up in a high language demand areas. So I have a student, first language is Spanish. We have a kind of like a mix up. We have one here. And so what best practice is just to follow up in the second, in a different language, would be your GC, your GA, which is your auditory processing. Your GC is the comprehension knowledge, the GA is the auditory processing, and then your long-term working memory. Those are the 3 Gs that I will most likely always follow a test in the different language. The moderate language demands your short-term working memory and your fluid reasoning, just kind of depending on the assessment. And also if it's gonna kind of like a make it or break it, is it going to affect the outcome of, is the student gonna gathering all the information, but is it going to affect the outcome of if they're going to meet the criteria or not? And then you have the other lower language demands of visual processing and processing speed. One other thing that I use is it's the CLEM, which is the cultural language interpretive language. So, and this is just a tool, and it just helps you kind of like determine if the testing results are valid. And I have a link that will be also posted it's a free tool for anyone to use, but it's the only tool that is out there that compares second language learners to other second language learners who have been exposed to English. And so it just kind of gives you the information if the student is performing as expected or unexpected. It does not give you the information as far as the student meets the criteria for a learning disability, or it's not a rule out for the language. This is just the information to help guide your, which is your GC, your comprehension knowledge of your 1G score. On your achievement test selection, you know, whenever we're testing for achievement, students should always be tested in the language that they're receiving instruction, or if they have received that instruction before. So my one student that was instructed in Mexico, and the parent reported that the student was attending school every day whenever they were in Mexico, and they're now in an English program. It's just best practice to, if the student has a low basic reading score in English, I want to know, does the student have a low basic reading skill in Spanish as well? But this to testing in both languages would be appropriate for that one student because the student has received instruction in both language. They may not be currently receiving the instruction currently or in that language, but they've received it prior. If the student is in a bilingual program, I just kind of went over that, the student will need to be assessed in both languages. One that that has the entire, or not the entire, but the 6 areas of testing is the aprovechamiento out of the batería. You can also pull some other achievement from like the Woodcock Munoz, but I kind of just, if I'm going to stick to one, I just want to just gather all my information from one battery. Just going over what Mary had stated about, you know, dyslexia. You still have the same dyslexia. Everything's still the same for Spanish, but you just have like the dyslexia primary characteristics. You're going to still have the same reading words in isolation. You're going to have difficulty decoding unfamiliar words, decoding or difficulty with oral reading, and difficulty in spelling. In our next slide, you're still going to have the same in Spanish, the dyslexia underlining causes. The underlining causes with phonological awareness, which is your auditory processing, your the rapid naming abilities, and your orthographic processing. Another one thing that I didn't include in here, but you're also going to have, I mean, as the bilingual testing, you're also going to have a lower score in your reading fluency. So that's just another underlining cause. A secondary deficits also come along with the reading comprehension and written expression. Whenever I'm writing a report, I don't ever include, and I don't ever say that these are the areas that are secondary deficits, but I do consider if the student has a low basic reading skill and a low reading fluency, the student most likely will have a lower reading comprehension. However, I don't specify that reading comprehension or written expression is due to a secondary deficit. Just try to keep that out. As far as like the order of skill, I included this information just because I really, on every single student that I test with, on my next slide, is the order of skill. Like I look at their language, and then I look at their decoding and phonics, and then their fluency, and then their reading comprehension. I look at where is the student struggling. And so if they're going to struggle in decoding and phonics, they're definitely going to struggle in fluency and reading comprehension. We also see that in phonics, spelling, and written expression. That is just, that is a lot of information. And before I even go out and assess any student, I probably have put maybe 45 minutes to an hour even before even seeing a student. I want to know, I want to try to get as much information as I can before I go out and I test a student, because we want to be able to provide the best practice that we have. Every student that I have ever tested, and as of today, I've been assigned 74 evaluations, and all bilingual or ESL. And every student to me is different. Every time I'm assigned a student, it's kind of it's like I'm opening a present. I don't know what I'm going to get into. I don't know what's in there, but we do provide the best practice that we can for every single student. And we want to make sure, and we want to be able to, everyone says roll out or roll in. We want to make sure that we include all that information and be able to justify our reasoning behind a student who meets the criteria for a learning disability or does not. We want to be able to explain our reasoning for that. So that is the end of my presentation.
Well, the chat has been very quiet. We haven't had any questions in the chat. But if anybody has a question, you're welcome to unmute your microphone and ask it out loud, or at this point, if you'd like to type it in the chat, you can do that as well. On a personal note, I really appreciated hearing about the different types of instruction that you could get in dual language or immersion programs and seeing that graph with the growth curves. My child participated in a two-way dual instruction or a two-way dual language program from K to 5. And that was a really eye-opening and great experience.
And I try to, whenever I'm going over an evaluation with a parent, I try to kind of like give them like just like a timeline. Well, we first start with here, and we kind of just try to go through the steps so that the parent especially is understanding and how we came up with how we determined that their child has a disability or does not have a disability. And even to the teachers and the campuses as well.
So we have one question to Christy. You made a reference to a data sheet. What all is it included?
You want me to, let me stop sharing and see if I can pull that up real quickly.
And I also have one question after this. My personal question after this, probably.
Now I've lost it. I'm sorry.
Oh, I don't see the message.
I think Debbie Torres sent me information. Debbie, can you send the information to all? I think it just came to me only.
Christy, do you want me to share that data sheet? I think I've got it now.
Yes.
Okay. Can you see it?
Yes, I can. And this is the data sheet that and I'm willing to share this with everyone. This is just to kind of help me to understand and to help write my report. This is information that I gather before I go and I test any student. I want to know what, well, number one, I want to know when it's due because I don't want to miss a timeline. But I want to know, like, have they been tested before? What is their home language? It's always just, and then I fall into that too. But their home language. We have our parents that will put English, and our students only speak Spanish. So I find that I put that information down, but I mean we consider other sources of data. I want to know, what STAR did they take? Did they take STAR in Spanish last year? And it's crazy because like once I'm putting all this data and all this great information in here, I'm looking at their CALP and it's like the student speaks higher in English and no Spanish, but last year they were given the STAR test in Spanish. So then it's kind of like, well, maybe that's why, you know, and these are all my thoughts before I'm even testing. I want to know what language the parent reported. I want to know. That is 100% very we need to know that information. We want to know, is our student who is speaking higher in English and enrolled in a dual language program, and then they're going home to an only Spanish only home. So I want to, you know, this is just for me, I want to know this good information. I've also, just because, you know, if I have the student right in front of me and I want to know just kind of like the information, I want to be able to have like every single G, and I want to be able to, like, since we have been, and because we want to know, we need to be able to roll out our language. And so I use the back sheet of my data sheet as just kind of like a guide, and I can see it all the information all together. And every time I share this, I always say, if you see anything wrong with it, or please let me know. This is what I have come up with again, just to kind of, and this is information that I've taken from like other sources and just kind of like compiled it into mine. I kind of color coordinated it. But this, I've also, you know, used others, and I've put it all together, compiled it to formulate this. But this just kind of gives me the information of what I'm looking at. What do I need to follow up in?
Christy, can you go back to the first page and just remind us on the left side, all of those G's? Can you remind us what each of those are? Because I'm sure that most parents don't even realize that language is divided into so many different parts, and that there's so many different parts to measure and to look at. So I'm sure you know them, but do you mind just going through? I see CG, CF. Remind me what those are.
So the GC, and this, I have this on the front page, but it's also on the back side. GC is the comprehension knowledge. And I have just kind of, whenever I'm going over it kind of with a parent, you know, like if I'm going over it just one-on-one, I always just say, you know, GC is just kind of like stuff that you know. Cosas que sabes. Like, what does the student know? The GF is the fluid reasoning, and it's problem solving with new stuff. So whenever I'm going over it with a parent, that's what I'm starting out with, and then we'll kind of read exactly what the GC is. Solución de problemas con cosas nuevas. The long-term working, the GLR is the long-term working memory, and that's just the ability to learn new stuff and I say spit it out later whenever you need it. We have the short-term working memory, which is the GSM, and that's just kind of like your brain's scratch pad. And it's just, you know, whenever I'm going over it, like again with a parent, I kind of just, you know, will summarize, oh, okay, so then, you know, once I kind of break it down to a level where everyone can understand, then we can go into the full definition. GS is the processing speed. GS is just your cognitive speed, your brain's internet connection, like how quickly stuff can go around in your head. GV, visual processing, and it's the ability to manipulate visually in your head. And then you have your GA, which is the auditory processing, and it's the ability to manipulate sounds in your head, ability to process sounds.
I appreciate that so much. Thank you.
And, you know, and like, this is mine, and everyone is more than welcome to it. This is, like I said, this is stuff that I've seen from others, and I've just included in mine stuff that I need on a daily before I even test. Like, here's my data sheet that I was working on. I haven't, and I'm going to test this student in 2 weeks, but I want to know the information. But on the back side of my data sheet, I have the areas, the front page, I have the GC, but I have the wording in the back. And I have to say it, I have to repeat it. That is just how my brain works. Whenever I say GC, even whenever I'm typing up my report, I'm not saying GC, I'm saying comprehension knowledge. I want to be able to understand that verbiage in my own brain, because I want to be able to, whenever I am understanding a student or whenever I'm including everything in my data sheet, I want to be able to understand it so that I can explain it in my reports, explain it to the campus and to the parents.
And thank you, Christy. We have one question and 2 questions. So one from Castiller. So if you look at Q&A, asking that you recommend bilingual student be tested in both languages. So is there any certain circumstance you recommend be tested in both? And that is also related to my question. I just wonder is if the student language is emergent in both languages, like a kindergarten and first or second grade, they are too young, too little in both.
Right.
So is there any recommendation and priority for the assessment?
So, it just depends if the student knows, both languages. Thankfully, the KBC, you can read the instructions in both languages. So you're kind of, and I hate using this term, shooting 2 birds with 1 stone. I don't like using that, but this is going to Castillo Vera. Do you recommend that bilingual students be tested in both languages? You can kind of, with the KBC, because you're testing, because you can give the instructions in both languages, you can kind of rule that out. But if you have a student who English is high and the student does not know any Spanish, there would be no need in that one cluster, or to even in any of the clusters, to even follow up in Spanish, because you have no reasoning as to why. Or if you're even looking at the student's CALP and it's 0/90, there would be no reason to test in both languages. However, like today's student, I mean, we had the 2 students my student who was kind of a little bit English and Spanish is right here. I definitely followed up in both languages. The same student, if you have a student who's in the dual language program or is being instructed in Spanish, as far as your achievement now, you don't have probable cause to test in a different language, because they've only been instructed in Spanish. So that would not be appropriate. But, and I say every student is so different, but then you have our other student who was in Mexico for kindergarten, 1st and 2nd, and then came here 3rd and 4th and instructed in Spanish in Mexico, and then is now in English. So for that student, if the student has a low reading fluency score in English, is that a true deficit? So for that one student, I'm going to test in Spanish a basic reading skill. And if they're both deficits, then that to me would determine that is a true deficit. And sometimes, like, I know it in my brain, and I understand, I believe, Mary, you were saying this, we have such a large population, but we have one bilingual evaluator for my district. And so whenever I am going over any of my information, I don't have anyone to go over this with. I try to talk to other evaluators, and any questions that they have, I want to be able to answer every single one of their questions.
What's the best way for people to get access to this form? Was it in the resources already that you shared, or would you like to send it to us?
It
Um,
is in the resources. It was
Oh, it is in
in
the resources already. Oh,
our
you thought of
handout.
everything. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. We probably didn't, but there's a handout that has links to some resources that we mentioned through our presentation. And then Christy's resource, this is in there as well. And then there's a link to the CLIM that you were talking about, Christy. So
yes.
people may want to take a look at that as well.
And you know, I just, if we can just talk about it, like every student is different. There's not one student is the same in my world and anyone's world. But I definitely, like I said, every time I'm assigned a new student, it's kind of like, oh, what's in there? What's in that gift? What's in that present?
I love the way you put that. And of course, we encourage you all to reach out to us. I got out of the PowerPoint, but the last page of the PowerPoint has our contact information, and you all have access to that. So please reach out to us if you have questions.